You have walked through seasons where silence felt like distance and delay felt like absence. Yet there is a truth deeper than what your emotions have been allowed to conclude. What feels like separation has never been separation at all. Even when you thought you were forgotten, you were never outside the reach of what holds you. This is not a message of pursuit, but of constant presence that never withdrew. There are moments in life when the heart mistakes stillness for abandonment. But stillness is not absence, it is often the quiet way presence proves it has never left. You have been seen in every turning, every hesitation, every silent prayer that never reached human ears. And now, listen closely, not as one trying to return, but as one who never left the gaze of the one who knows you entirely. There are truths that do not announce themselves with noise or spectacle, but rather settle upon the soul like something ancient being remembered rather than newly learned. You are never beyond the boundaries of divine attention is one such truth, and it resists the modern instinct to measure life by visibility or emotional certainty. For you have often assumed that what you cannot perceive is what is not present. Yet that assumption collapses the moment you consider how little of reality is ever held within the narrow frame of human awareness. It is a strange thing, this habit of believing that attention must feel like attention in order to be real. As though the unseen mind is limited to the same methods as the human one. As though nearness must always announce itself with warmth, with signs, with unmistakable reassurance. But what if attention of a higher order is not dependent on your ability to detect it? What if the very structure of your existence is already held within a gaze that does not blink, does not wander, does not diminish when you forget it exists? You have lived, at times, as though you were moving in and out of notice, as though your choices and wanderings could shift you from presence into obscurity. Yet even this idea of obscurity presumes that you are capable of falling outside the framework that sustains you. It is rather like a thought believing it has escaped the mind that is thinking it. The irony is subtle but profound. The attempt to step outside attention is itself still contained within it. There are moments when suffering convinces you that you have been overlooked. Not because the suffering is proof of absence, but because pain narrows perception until only what hurts feels real. In such moments, attention feels like something that should interrupt the pain if it is present. Yet attention, in its truest form, is not always interruption, sometimes it is endurance, the holding of a thing even when it cannot yet be changed. A watchful stillness that does not abandon the unfolding process, simply because it is difficult to observe. And so you misread the silence. You mistake the absence of immediate resolution for absence itself. But silence, in the deeper architecture of existence, is not void. It is fullness restrained, meaning held in suspension until the moment it can be rightly understood. To be within attention is not always to be within explanation. There are truths that watch you long before they speak to you. Even your sense of distance is constructed from within the very nearness you doubt. You measure separation as though you were standing outside the reality that contains both you and what you believe is far from you. But nothing that constitutes your being has ever existed outside that sustaining regard. Your breath does not step outside air to continue breathing, nor does your thought escape the mind that forms it in order to be observed. And yet, the paradox remains that you feel distant. This feeling is not dismissed, but understood as part of the human condition that interprets reality through sensation rather than structure. You are accustomed to equating nearness with emotional intensity, forgetting that the deepest forms of presence often refuse to be theatrical. They remain steady when everything within you expects movement. They persist without announcement, and in that persistence they shape the very ground upon which your questions about distance arise. Even when you begin to wonder whether you have ever truly been outside that reach that you cannot see, cannot measure, cannot step beyond even in thought distance, was only ever a perception, never a reality, and this is where the human mind begins to wrestle with its own limits. For perception is a powerful interpreter, but it is not the author of truth. It takes fragments of experience, silence, delay, uncertainty, and weaves them into conclusions that feel absolute. Yet what feels absolute within the mind is not always aligned with what is actual in the deeper structure of existence. You have called certain seasons far away, not because they were truly removed from you, but because your awareness could not trace the fullness of what was still holding you within it. It is a curious tendency of the soul to convert delay into distance. When something is not immediately understood, it is often classified as absent. When an answer does not arrive in the expected form, it is assumed to have been withheld entirely. Yet reality is not obligated to conform to the speed of expectation. What is unfolding beyond your comprehension is not necessarily withdrawing from you. It may simply be moving through dimensions of meaning that your present awareness cannot yet translate. You have measured nearness by sensation, by emotional confirmation, by the comforting alignment of circumstance. But perception is easily shaped by internal turbulence. A restless heart will interpret stillness as separation and uncertainty as abandonment. Yet neither of these interpretations has authority over what is actually sustained beyond your noticing. The fact that something is not felt does not place it outside the field of its reality. There is also a subtle illusion embedded within the human experience of time. Because you live moment by moment, you assume that what is not present in this moment is somehow disconnected from you. But continuity is not dependent on awareness. Just as the unseen roots of a tree continue to draw nourishment even when the surface appears unchanged, so too does the underlying structure of your life remain connected to what you believe has moved beyond reach. The visible is only a fraction of what is maintained in the invisible. In your own inner narrative, you have likely revised your understanding of certain chapters of life based on how they felt while they were being lived. Yet meaning often reveals itself only in hindsight, where what once felt like distance is later recognized as necessary positioning. What seemed like separation was often the shaping of something you could not yet inhabit. Even now, there are layers of your present experience that will one day be reinterpreted not as absence, but as precision. And so distance begins to dissolve when examined closely. It cannot sustain itself under deeper inquiry because it relies upon assumption rather than structure. It is constructed from incomplete data gathered through limited perception. When that limitation is acknowledged, the concept begins to lose its authority over how reality is understood. Even the feeling of being far is itself contained within something that does not move away. For you cannot experience separation from within total absence. You can only experience it from within a framework that still includes you. The very awareness of distance proves that you have not been removed from the field in which awareness itself is possible. Thus, what you have called distance has always been a translation error between perception and truth, a misreading of continuity as interruption, and of unfolding as withdrawal, even when nothing in the deeper order has ever ceased to hold you within reach. Every delay carried meaning you could not yet interpret. And this is where the human spirit begins its most difficult training, learning to endure what it cannot yet decode. For meaning is not absent simply because it is not immediately readable. It often arrives wrapped in forms that resist early understanding, as though truth itself respects a timing deeper than urgency. You have stood in seasons where answers felt withheld, but what was truly happening was not withholding, rather shaping. It is a common error of the heart to assume that what is not explained is therefore meaningless. Yet much of what forms a life is not understood while it is forming. You do not perceive the architecture of growth while you are still within its construction. The process is too close, too immersive, too entangled with your present state to be seen as a completed pattern. And so you mistake the unfinished for the insignificant. There is a kind of hidden intelligence in delay, though it rarely presents itself in a way that satisfies immediate desire. Delay does not always announce its purpose, it often conceals it, not out of neglect, but out of necessity. Some meanings are too large to be delivered in the moment they are requested. They require the refinement of time, the layering of experience, the quiet accumulation of perspective that only later reveals coherence. You have lived through moments where you questioned the absence of resolution, where silence felt like an answer that refused to speak in your language. Yet even silence, in its apparent refusal, is participating in formation. It is not empty, it is preparatory. It is the space in which premature conclusions are prevented so that deeper understanding is not prematurely closed off. There is also a hidden discipline within delay that resists immediate comfort. It interrupts the human tendency to control outcomes through expectation. In this interruption, something subtle is being trained within you, the capacity to remain present without demanding premature closure. This is not passive waiting, but but active unknowing, where the mind is restrained from forcing meaning before it has matured. And so what you once labeled as delay begins to take on the shape of unseen alignment. Not alignment with convenience, but with depth. For what arrives too early often lacks the structure to be sustained, and what is withheld may be doing so in order to preserve its integrity until the moment it can be rightly received. Even your confusion during these seasons is not wasted. It is part of the interpretive process, where understanding is stretched beyond its familiar boundaries. Confusion forces you to loosen the grip of assumed certainty, and in doing so, prepares you for a more stable form of clarity that does not collapse under complexity. There is a quiet consistency in the way meaning operates beneath the surface of your experience. It does not abandon you during delay, it simply refuses to be reduced to immediacy. It works through layers that only become visible when you are no longer standing inside the urgency of the moment. And so every delay becomes less about absence and more about unreadiness, not in you as deficiency, but in timing as design. What you could not interpret then was never outside meaning, it was always inside a meaning too large to be seen from where you stood at the time. Silence was not withdrawal, but sustained presence without interruption. And this is where the human imagination begins to misread the nature of what it cannot hear. For silence, to the untrained ear of expectation, resembles absence. It carries no obvious signal, no immediate confirmation, no audible reassurance that something remains engaged with you. And yet, silence is not the opposite of presence. It is often its most refined expression, stripped of anything that would distort its purity. You have been conditioned to equate communication with nearness, as though only what speaks is what remains connected. But this assumption belongs to a limited understanding of how reality operates. Not all forms of presence announce themselves. Some forms of nearness are too steady to fluctuate into noise. They do not withdraw when language ceases, they simply continue in a mode that does not rely on interruption to prove continuity. There is a subtle discomfort that arises when silence persists too long in the human experience. The mind, seeking structure, begins to interpret it as disengagement. It assumes that what is not responding is no longer attentive. Yet attention does not depend on constant signaling. In fact, the most stable forms of attention are those that do not need to be reaffirmed at every moment. They remain even when they are not perceived. Silence, in this deeper sense, is not a gap in connection, but a form of restraint within connection. It is presence refusing to distort itself into unnecessary noise. It is continuity that does not require validation through repetition. And yet, because human perception is calibrated toward responsiveness, it often mislabels this restraint as absence, as though stillness were equivalent to departure. You have lived through moments where you reached outward and received no immediate reply, and in that interval your mind constructed narratives of distance. But what you experienced was not a withdrawal of presence, it was a withdrawal of distraction. Silence removes the noise that would otherwise interfere with the deeper continuity that does not need to announce itself in order to remain intact. There is also a hidden steadiness in silence that resists emotional fluctuation. It does not rise and fall with the urgency of your inner state. It remains unchanged even when your interpretation of it changes repeatedly. This constancy is often mistaken for indifference, but it is closer to endurance without interruption. A form of attention that does not require expressive validation to remain fully engaged. In moments of silence, the human mind is often forced inward, not because it has been abandoned, but because it has been invited into a different mode of awareness. Without external signals to depend upon, perception begins to confront its own limitations. It is in this confrontation that deeper forms of understanding begin to form, though not immediately recognized as such while they are still unfolding. Silence also protects what speech would prematurely expose. There are processes that cannot be translated without distortion if spoken too early. To preserve their integrity, they remain unspoken until they have matured beyond vulnerability. What feels like absence of communication may in fact be the safeguarding of something still in formation, still too delicate to be expressed without being misunderstood or diminished, and so silence becomes a kind of continuous holding. A steady nearness that does not shift its position simply because it is not being perceived. It remains consistent even when interpretation falters, even when emotional reading mislabels it as distance. It does not cease because it is not acknowledged, nor does it recede because it is not felt in the expected way. What you have called silence has never been empty. It has always been full of a presence that does not need to break itself in order to remain real. Even in your wandering, you are held within unseen order, and this is where the illusion of randomness begins to dissolve under closer reflection. For what appears as wandering is often only the surface impression of a deeper coherence that is not immediately visible to the one living through it. You have moved through choices, pauses, turns, and detours that at times felt unanchored, yet movement itself does not imply absence of structure. It only implies that the structure is not always accessible to immediate perception. There is a natural tendency within the human experience to interpret deviation as disconnection. When life does not proceed along a straight and expected line, it is often assumed that something has gone wrong, or that order has been lost. Yet order is not always linear. Some forms of order are complex, layered, and multi-directional, revealing themselves only when viewed from a vantage point beyond the immediacy of experience. What feels like wandering from within may be revealed as precise alignment from beyond it. You have likely looked back on certain paths and wondered why they unfolded the way they did, as though they were shaped by uncertainty rather than design. But uncertainty is often only the feeling of not yet recognizing the underlying pattern. A pattern does not cease to exist simply because it has not yet been interpreted. It continues to operate beneath the surface of confusion, holding together what appears fragmented into something that is not fragmented at all. Even your moments of hesitation were not outside this unseen order. Hesitation is often mistaken for lack of direction, yet it can also be the point at which unseen correction occurs. There are movements within a life that are not driven by conscious intention alone, but by deeper alignment processes that resist immediate explanation. What you call pause may in fact be recalibration within a system that is far more integrated than it appears at first glance. There is also a quiet continuity that persists through all apparent deviations. You have never truly moved outside the field in which your life is being shaped. Every step, even those that felt uncertain, remained within a framework that does not collapse simply because it is not being consciously tracked. The sense of being lost arises not from actual dislocation, but from limited visibility of the larger coherence that still holds every movement within it. Wandering, in this sense, is not abandonment of direction, but movement within direction that has not yet been fully revealed. It is the experience of walking through a pattern before the pattern becomes legible. And in that state, interpretation lags behind reality, creating the impression of disorder where there is only an order that exceeds immediate comprehension. There is also something quietly formative about being unable to fully trace your own path while you are still within it. It prevents premature conclusions about where you are going and forces a deeper reliance on what is not yet visible. This reliance is not blindness, but trust in structure that is not dependent on constant confirmation. It allows movement to continue without requiring full understanding at every step. Even the sense of unpredictability in your journey has not been outside coherence. It has been part of a larger unfolding that does not reveal its design all at once. Instead, it distributes understanding across time, allowing fragments to appear meaningful only when enough of the structure has been lived through to recognize their connection. And so what you have called wandering has always been participation in a deeper order that does not abandon you to randomness. Even when randomness is how it feels from within the moment itself, what you called far was always fully encompassed in reach. And the difficulty in grasping this lies not in the nature of what surrounds you, but in the way perception insists on dividing reality into compartments of nearness and distance. The human mind, operating within its accustomed limits, treats far as something external to containment, something that lies beyond the perimeter of influence or awareness. Yet this assumption collapses the moment you begin to consider that nothing which exists can be placed outside the field in which existence itself is being sustained. There is a subtle contradiction in the way distance is experienced. To call something far is already to hold it within thought, and what is held within thought is not outside the reach of the mind that holds it. In this way, even your most distant perceptions are contained within a closer reality than the language you use to describe them can admit. You have never once stepped outside the framework that allows you to recognize something as far away. In that recognition alone, there is already contact, already inclusion, already an unbroken continuity that resists the story of separation. The feeling of far is often born from limitation of access rather than limitation of presence. When something is not immediately available to your senses or not readily responsive to your desire, it is marked as distant. Yet accessibility is not the same as existence. What is not immediately reachable is not therefore outside reach, it is simply not presently disclosed in the form you expect. There are dimensions of nearness that do not obey the rules of instant retrieval, and yet remain entirely within the sphere in which your life unfolds. It is also important to recognize how often the idea of distance is constructed from the standpoint of desire. When the heart longs for something and does not immediately receive it, it interprets the delay as spatial separation. But longing does not measure geography, it measures intensity. And intensity, while powerful, is not an accurate map of reality. It exaggerates absence where there is only latency, and it amplifies silence into apparent remoteness. Yet neither intensity nor silence has the authority to relocate what remains structurally present. You have lived through moments where what you valued most seemed removed from you by layers of circumstance, timing, or misunderstanding. In those moments, the mind concluded that reach had been exceeded, that the boundary had been crossed into irretrievable distance. Yet even then, the very awareness of what you believed to be far proves its continued inclusion within your perceptual field. Nothing can be declared distant without first being held in awareness, close enough to be named. There is a deeper continuity that undermines the entire architecture of far and near. It suggests that what you call separation is often only rearrangement of visibility. What is not visible in one configuration of experience may be fully present in another. The limitation lies not in the absence of what is sought, but in the angle from which it is being approached. Change the angle, and what was once called unreachable reveals itself as already contained within the same hole that has never been breached. Even your sense of yearning participates in this structure. It does not arise from actual disconnection, but from the tension between perception and fullness. It is the feeling generated when awareness encounters something already included within its field, but not yet recognized as such. In that sense, yearning is not evidence of separation, but of proximity not yet understood in its proper form, and so what you have called far has always existed within the same sustaining reach that holds even your thought about distance itself, never once stepping outside the encompassing reality in which both nearness and distance are only variations of perception. Within a unity that does not divide itself from what it contains, you have always lived within the nearness you were searching for. Though the mind is slow to accept what does not arrive in the shape of expectation, there is a peculiar restlessness in the human condition that assumes nearness must feel like recognition, must present itself with clarity, warmth, and unmistakable certainty. Yet nearness, in its truest form, is not dependent upon being noticed. It is not summoned by awareness, it is already the condition within which awareness itself arises. The search for nearness often begins with the assumption that it has been lost. But loss is only meaningful where separation is real, and separation is never as complete as perception insists it is. You have not been moving towards something entirely absent. You have been learning to recognize what has always been structurally present beneath every movement you have made. The irony is that what you sought externally has always been the very ground upon which the seeking itself was taking place. There is a subtle distortion that occurs when the heart interprets distance as evidence of absence. In doing so, it overlooks the possibility that nearness does not always announce itself through emotional clarity. Some forms of nearness are so constant that they fade into the background of experience, unnoticed precisely because they do not withdraw. What does not leave is often taken for granted as though it were never there, not because it is faint, but because it is continuous. You have lived through moments of searching, of reaching, of wondering whether what you longed for existed beyond the boundaries of your immediate experience. Yet even that reaching was occurring within nearness, not outside of it. The act of seeking itself is contained within what it seeks. There is nowhere it could have begun that was not already within the field of what you are attempting to find. This is the paradox that dissolves the illusion of distance, that all movement toward is already movement within. Nearness is not something that increases or decreases based on your awareness of it. It does not expand when recognized, nor contract when forgotten. It remains steady, unaffected by the fluctuations of perception that rise and fall within the human mind. What changes is not the nearness itself, but the ability to interpret it without distortion. And that ability is often refined through experience that initially appears as delay, silence, or separation. There is also a deeper steadiness in the structure of existence that does not rely on recognition to remain intact. You do not fall out of nearness simply because you fail to perceive it. You do not exit the condition in which you are held simply because your awareness shifts elsewhere. The continuity of nearness is not dependent on your attention to it, rather, your attention is one of its expressions. Even your moments of doubt have taken place within this same nearness. Doubt does not transport you outside of what is real, it unfolds entirely within it. The questions you have asked, the uncertainty you have carried, the longing you have felt, all of these are movements occurring inside a reality that does not cease to include you, even when you struggle to include it in your understanding. And so what you have been searching for has never been at a distance that could be closed or crossed, because you have never once existed outside of its immediate and sustaining presence, even in the very act of wondering where it might be found.